I think the issue of, loving your enemy versus forgiving, your enemy is a kind of very, interesting idea. And, again, you have images of Jesus offering, forgiveness. He says, God, may you forgive, Lord, may you forgive the people when he's on the cross, for they know not what they do. Judaism kind of regards forgiveness a little bit differently. And I think because of that, for me personally, I actually think that the idea of loving your enemy is actually a more useful idea than the idea of forgiveness. And I'll explain why. In Judaism, first of all, you can only forgive if the person who you're forgiving wants to be forgiven, right? In other words, if a person has to first ask for your forgiveness, right? In addition to that, the person has to want to change their ways, to recognize that what they've done is wrong. They have to, undertake to make amends and to not go back to what they've already done. And so there's all these kind of requirements for forgiveness that make it often very difficult, right? Because what happens if the person still hates you and is still, has these, doesn't regret at all what they've done? So in that case, sort of from the Jewish perspective, forgiveness isn't really an option, but you could still love your enemy. And so in that way, I think it's more useful. Another reason, there's a book called The Sunflower. I don't know how many of you have read it. So it's by Simon Wiesenthal, who was a Holocaust survivor. And he kind of tells a story in The Sunflower of, it was, towards the end of the war, and he was he was called into the areas were already kind of falling out of Nazi control. They were retreating, and he comes to a hospital, and there was a nurse there, and she says, she said, "Are you a Jew?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "Well, I really need your help." Okay, and so Simon Wiesenthal was wondering what's going on, and he came up and he walked, followed the nurse, and came into a room. And in the room, there was a man, completely in bandages. You couldn't even see his face. He was, terribly injured. He was obviously on his deathbed. And he said, brought Simon Wiesenthal, came close to him, and he said, are you a Jew? He said, yes. He's like, I've done terrible things. I've killed many, many Jewish people. I've, done horrific things. I want to ask for your forgiveness for them. For what I've done. And Simon Wiesenthal kind of didn't know what to do, right? And part of the question of it is, can you forgive someone who's done something terrible to another person, right? And so I think that's in some ways also a kind of, limitation of forgiveness, whereas you can love someone, an enemy, even if they've, even no matter who they've done something terrible to. And the last thing I would say is that also in forgiveness, not necessarily, but there also can be a sort of kind of power relationship where, the person asking forgiveness kind of like, abases themselves, and the person offering forgiveness is in this position of like authority over them, standing over them. And it's almost like there's a sense of superiority of the person who is being asked for forgiveness over the person who is asking for forgiveness. And I feel like loving your enemy is something that actually has more of a potential for occurring on a kind of more equal plane. And that's why I think personally that the idea of loving your enemy is actually a more useful idea, a more practical idea than forgiveness.
I want to thank you, Micah.
I want to dovetail on what Micah was saying. Simon Wiesenthal was one of my early mentors, and he's from Vienna, Austria, and I went to Vienna, Austria in 1980 to meet him, and I had dinner with him and picked his brain. Simon Wiesenthal is probably best known as the most famous Nazi hunter. He brought a lot of war criminals to justice, Nazis who committed these horrific crimes against Jewish people, to the World Crimes Commission or whatever. And he was very successful at doing that. And I've had the great pleasure of doing some work with the Simon Wiesenthal Center here in this country. I agree with what Micah is saying. I know a lot of people, do forgive their enemies right off the bat, whether the person asks for it or not. And I think, some of that is to absolve oneself from falling into the same trap that their enemy perpetrated upon whatever that person did. Like, we often hear things of when somebody has done some horrific crime, murdered some mother's son, and the mother comes in the courtroom and says, I forgive you. This person is showing no remorse, but I forgive you. Because when you put hate out, it's very easy to get triggered and want to hate back. And then it becomes just a cycle of hate, and destroying one another, which is not good. So rather than allow you to entrap me in your hatred and make me become hateful towards you, even though you have no remorse, I'm going to forgive you anyway. And that absolves me from falling into that trap. I think, that's a reason why a lot of people do forgive. Sometimes I struggle with forgiving somebody who has done something, horrific, or what I consider to be horrific to me or somebody in my family or something like that. But people have different reasons for forgiving. But I think we need to love one another unconditionally. Maybe not love what they do, but love unconditionally. And forgiveness can be a personal thing. Whether if you want to forgive somebody, whether or not they seek forgiveness or not, is totally up to you. Ultimately, I don't believe in forgiving people unless they take responsibility and hold themselves accountable for whatever it is they did and show that remorse. And there is redemption, but ultimately, they have to answer to a higher power.